The courtroom in Asheville smelled like old wood polish and stale air conditioning. Cliff Tierney stood near the defense table with his hands clasped behind his back, the way the Marine Corps had taught him to stand 40 years earlier. He was 64 years old. His knees ached, his hair had gone white at the temples. But his posture hadn't changed since boot camp, and neither had the habit of keeping his face perfectly still when the world fell apart around him. Across the aisle sat Diane. 31 years of marriage, and she wouldn't even look at him. She leaned into the man beside her, a developer from Charlotte named Bradley Sloan, who wore a navy suit that probably cost more than the old Ford parked outside. Diane had changed her hair, shorter now, lighter. She looked like someone Cliff didn't recognize anymore. The judge read the final page of the decree in the flat tone of a man who had done 1,000 times. The primary residence, retirement accounts, and financial assets are awarded to Diane Tierney. Mr. Tierney will retain sole ownership of the inherited property in Yancey County, a parcel of approximately 25 acres with one uninhabitable structure, previously belonging to Mr. Tierney's grandfather. Diane's lawyer nodded without standing. The property has no road access, no utilities, and a tax-assessed value well below market consideration. We believe this is an equitable arrangement. Equitable. Cliff let the word pass through him the way he had learned to let mortar blasts pass through him in Fallujah. You didn't flinch. You didn't argue. You just kept breathing until the dust settled. The gavel came down softly. It was finished. Cliff exhaled and looked down. Lying beside his chair, perfectly still, was Kodiak. The German shepherd had sat through the entire hearing without making a sound. 85 pounds of muscle, loyalty, and dark, intelligent eyes that never left Cliff's face. Cliff had found Kodiak 7 years earlier at a military working dog retirement facility in Virginia. The dog had been scheduled for euthanasia after his handler was killed in Afghanistan. Nobody wanted an aging war dog with scars across his shoulder and a deep suspicion of strangers. Cliff had driven 6 hours to bring him home. They hadn't been apart since. Now Kodiak rose and pressed his nose gently against Cliff's palm. "I know," Cliff whispered. "Let's go." He picked up the thin folder containing the deed to his grandfather's land and started for the door. Behind him, he heard Diane laugh at something Bradley said. The sound echoed across the marble floor like a stone skipping across water. Outside, the November air hit Cliff's face. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose in the distance, their ridges dark against a pale gray sky. Cliff stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, staring at nothing. Diane's voice came from behind him. She had stopped on the steps, Bradley already walking toward a black Mercedes parked at the curb. "You'll be fine out there, Cliff," she called. "Fresh air is supposed to be good for people your age." Bradley opened the passenger door for her. He smiled at Cliff the way people smile at something they've already forgotten. Diane added one more thing before climbing in. "Honestly, I'm not even sure that shack is still standing." The Mercedes pulled away. Cliff watched it disappear around the corner. Kodiak sat beside him, tail still, eyes up. Cliff looked down at the dog. "Well," he said quietly, "guess it's you and me." Kodiak's tail moved once, slow and certain. The drive from Asheville took almost 2 hours. Highway 19 wound north through the mountains, past small towns that seemed to shrink the further Cliff drove. Burnsville, Micaville. Then the road narrowed, and the signs stopped altogether. Cliff turned onto a gravel track that hadn't been maintained in years. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. Potholes jolted the suspension. Kodiak sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the forest close in around them. Cliff's grandfather, Eugene Tierney, had bought this land in the early 1960s. He had been a quiet man who worked in the mica mines near Spruce Pine and spent his weekends hunting turkey in these mountains. After Eugene passed in 1987, the property drifted into legal limbo. Cliff's father had no interest in it. Cliff himself had been deployed overseas for most of his adult life. The land had simply waited, unclaimed and untouched, until a divorce lawyer pulled it from a county records search and added it to the settlement as Cliff's sole remaining asset. 25 acres of forest. One structure. No electricity, no running water, no neighbors within 5 kilometers. The truck crested a small ridge, and the trees opened into a clearing. Cliff stopped the engine. The cabin sat at the far end of the clearing like something the forest was slowly swallowing. The roof had collapsed on the left side. Vines covered the porch. 2 windows had shattered, leaving dark, empty holes in the walls. The wood had turned gray with decades of weather, and the whole structure leaned slightly downhill, as if it had grown tired of standing. Kodiak tilted his head. Cliff stared at it for a long time. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The silence was enormous. No traffic, no machinery, just wind in the spruce trees and the distant sound of water running somewhere below the ridge. Kodiak jumped down and immediately began circling the clearing, nose low, tail level. Professional assessment. The dog had never lost his training. Cliff walked toward the cabin. Up close, the damage was worse. The porch boards had rotted through in several places. The door hung crooked on one hinge. The smell of damp wood and animal droppings drifted from inside. He pushed the door open carefully. It groaned and scraped across the warped floor. One room. A stone fireplace against the back wall. A wooden counter that had once been a kitchen. A ladder leading to a small loft. Everything coated in dust and leaves and the scattered evidence of raccoons. Cliff set his bag down and looked around slowly. His mind did what it always did. Assess. Prioritize. Survive. Roof first. Then the windows. Then heat. By nightfall, Cliff had nailed boards across the worst holes, covered the broken windows with plastic sheeting from the truck, and built a small fire in the stone hearth. The chimney drew well enough that only a little smoke curled back into the room. He heated a can of soup over the flames and ate it sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. Kodiak lay beside him, chin resting on Cliff's boot. Outside, the mountain darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no glow from distant towns, and just the black shape of trees against a sky full of stars. Cliff stared into the fire. The crackling wood sounded different in the silence. For a moment it became something else. The pop of small arms fire. Radio static, shouting in Arabic. Kodiak shifted immediately. The dog pressed his body firmly against Cliff's side. Warm, steady, present. Cliff closed his eyes, breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth, the way the VA therapist had taught him, the way Kodiak had reinforced 1,000 times without being asked. The fire returned, the cabin returned. The quiet mountain night settled back around them. You always know, Cliff whispered. Kodiak's tail tapped the floor once. They slept together beside the dying fire. Sometime past midnight, Kodiak lifted his head sharply. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Cliff was awake instantly, hand reaching for the flashlight before his eyes were fully open. He listened. Heavy movement outside. Branches snapping. Something large. Cliff eased toward the window and peeled back the plastic. A black bear moved across the clearing, maybe 30 meters away. Massive shoulders, head swinging low. Kodiak stood rigid beside him, every muscle taut. The bear paused, sniffed the air toward the cabin. Kodiak let out one deep bark, sharp and commanding, the kind of sound that carried authority across any species. The bear flinched. It stared toward the cabin for 3 seconds. Then it turned and crashed back into the forest. Cliff looked down at Kodiak. Nice work, Marine. Kodiak wagged his tail and returned to his spot by the fire. The first week passed in silence and labor. Cliff repaired the porch. He patched the roof with salvaged boards and tar paper from a hardware store in Burnsville, 40 minutes down the mountain. He cleared brush from around the cabin and found the stream that ran along the western edge of the property. Clean water, cold enough to numb his hands in seconds. Each day the cabin looked slightly less like a ruin, and slightly more like a place where someone intended to stay. Kodiak explored every corner of the property with methodical focus. He mapped the deer trails, the rabbit burrows, the places where the forest floor gave way to exposed rock. He checked the perimeter each morning and each evening, as if the clearing were a forward operating base that needed constant surveillance. On the 9th morning, Cliff was replacing boards along the back wall when he heard it. Scratch. He stopped. Scratch! Scratch! Kodiak stood at the far corner of the cabin, his front paws working against the base of the wall. Not playfully, deliberately, the way he had been trained to indicate a find. Cliff set down his hammer and walked over. What've you got? Kodiak scratched harder. His claws raked against the old wood with a sound that echoed slightly. Strangely, Cliff frowned. He knelt beside the dog and knocked on the board. Thud. Solid. He moved his fist 6 inches to the right and knocked again. Hollow. Cliff's pulse shifted. He knocked again on the same spot. Hollow, definitely hollow. He grabbed a pry bar and carefully worked it beneath the edge of the board. The wood resisted, then cracked free with a dry snap. Behind it was darkness, not the inside of the wall, a gap, a space. Cliff pulled another board loose. Cold air breathed out from the opening, carrying the smell of old stone and something into the cavity. For a moment, he didn't move. Sitting at the bottom of a narrow compartment, roughly 2 feet deep, was a metal strongbox, iron corners, a heavy clasp green with oxidation. The thing looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. Kodiak barked once, proud and certain. Cliff reached in carefully and dragged the box out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the floor and knelt beside it. Dust rose in the sunlight. The clasp had rusted open long ago. Cliff lifted the lid. The hinges screamed. Inside were bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Cliff unwrapped the first one with steady hands. Maps. Old maps. Hand-drawn with ink that had faded to brown. Survey lines. Elevation markers. And handwriting, small and precise, dated 1851. Cliff unfolded the largest carefully. His eyes moved across the faded markings until they stopped on a notation circled twice in red ink. Primary gold vein. Eastern slope below granite outcrop. Samples confirm high-grade ore. Development suspended. Insufficient capital, following partner's withdrawal. Cliff sat back on his heels. The name at the bottom of the map read Josiah Plank, Mineral Surveyor, Burke County, North Carolina. Cliff looked at Kodiak. The dog tilted his head. Diane called this place worthless, Cliff said quietly. He looked back at the map, then toward the window, where the ridge rose sharply above the tree line. She might have been wrong. Inside the strongbox were also small cloth pouches containing rock samples. When Cliff turned one in the sunlight, a vein of bright yellow metal glinted unmistakably through the gray stone. The Carolina Gold Rush. Cliff knew the history. Before the 1849 rush to California, North Carolina had been the largest gold-producing state in the country. Mines had operated throughout the western mountains for decades. Some had been lost, abandoned, or forgotten when the prospectors headed west. Josiah Plank had apparently found a vein on this very land, and then, for whatever reason, had sealed his discovery inside a cabin wall and disappeared from history. Cliff drove to Spruce Pine the next afternoon. The town sat in a valley surrounded by some of the most mineral-rich geology in the eastern United States. Mica, feldspar, quartz, and yes, gold had all been pulled from these mountains. He found a geological consulting office on a side street. A woman named Hazel Drummond ran the operation. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with calloused hands that suggested she spent more time in the field than behind her desk. Cliff spread the map across her work table without explanation. Found this inside a wall. Hazel studied it silently for nearly 5 minutes. Then she picked up one of the ore samples and held it under a magnifying lamp. "Where exactly is this property?" she asked. "Yancey County, about 10 kilometers northwest of Burnsville." Hazel set the sample down carefully. "Mr. Tierney, this is native gold in quartz matrix. If the vein described on this map is real and runs where Plank marked it," she paused, "you might be sitting on a significant deposit." "How significant?" Hazel leaned back. "Hard to know without a proper survey. But based on this sample and the geology of the region," she looked at him directly, "potentially millions." Cliff drove back to the cabin in silence. Kodiak sat in the passenger seat watching the mountains pass. When they arrived, Cliff sat on the porch for a long time. The sun was setting behind the ridge. The clearing glowed with amber light. Kodiak lay beside him. "My grandfather bought this place for almost nothing," Cliff said. "Hunted turkey here on weekends. Never knew what was underneath. Kodiak rested his chin on Cliff's knee. Over the following weeks, Cliff explored the ridge carefully. He marked locations where exposed quartz showed traces of gold. Hazel visited twice to take samples and run field tests. Each visit confirmed what the old map had promised. The vein was real. It ran along the eastern slope of the ridge, exactly where Josiah Plank had recorded it 170 years earlier. Cliff began small-scale extraction, nothing industrial. Hand tools, careful trenches, respect for the mountain that had kept its secret for so long. One morning in early spring, almost 5 months after he had arrived, Cliff heard an engine on the dirt road. He straightened up from the trench he was working and looked toward the clearing. A black Mercedes rolled slowly into view. Kodiak was on his feet instantly. Low growl. Ears forward. 2 people stepped out. Cliff recognized them both. Diane wore sunglasses and a coat that looked new. Bradley Sloan stood beside her, already scanning the property with the calculating eyes of a man who measured everything in dollar signs. A third person emerged from the back seat, a man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. Cliff walked down from the ridge slowly. Kodiak stayed at his side. Diane removed her sunglasses. "Hello, Cliff." Cliff said nothing. Bradley spoke first. "Mr. Tierney, we understand you've made some discoveries on this property." Cliff looked at Diane. She didn't look away this time. Her expression was careful, composed, the way it always was when she wanted something. The lawyer opened his briefcase. "We're here to discuss a potential claim regarding the mineral rights associated with this land. Our position is that the property's mineral value was not disclosed during the divorce settlement, which may constitute grounds for revisiting the asset distribution." Cliff listened to every word. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to the lawyer. The man read it. His face changed. "What?" Diane stepped forward. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This is a certified legal opinion confirming that inherited property is excluded from marital asset claims under North Carolina law. The mineral rights transfer with the deed. They belong solely to Mr. Tierney." Diane stared at Cliff. "You planned for this?" Cliff shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I just learned to read the fine print. Something I should have done 30 years ago." The clearing went quiet. Wind moved through the spruce trees. Somewhere down the slope, the stream ran over smooth stones. "This isn't finished," Bradley said. Cliff met his eyes steadily. "It is on my land." Kodiak let out a low, measured growl. Not aggressive, just clear. Diane turned without another word and walked back to the car. Bradley followed. The lawyer hesitated, then joined them. The Mercedes reversed down the dirt road and disappeared into the trees. Cliff stood in the clearing for a long moment after they left. Then he crouched beside Kodiak and rubbed the dog's neck. "Good boy." Kodiak wagged his tail. 2 years passed. The ridge gave up its gold slowly, the way mountains give up everything. Cliff never rushed it. He hired local workers from Burnsville and Spruce Pine. Men and women who knew these mountains, who understood that you took what the land offered and didn't demand more. He built a proper cabin beside the old one. The original shack stayed exactly as it was. Cliff wouldn't touch it. That was where Kodiak had scratched at the wall. That was where everything had changed. The operation never became large. Cliff refused every offer from mining corporations and investment groups. The gold provided enough for the workers, enough to maintain the land, enough to build something. Cliff hadn't planned but couldn't stop from growing. Veterans started arriving. Word had spread through the communities that gathered in small towns across the southern Appalachians. A Marine in the mountains was running a fair operation and didn't ask too many questions about the past. Cliff built cabins along the tree line, simple structures with good roofs and working stoves. Men who had carried invisible wars inside their heads came to the clearing and found work. Some stayed weeks, some stayed permanently. The mountain didn't care about their records or their nightmares. It only asked that they show up and do honest work. Kodiak moved among them like an old commanding officer making rounds. He seemed to know which men needed space, and which needed someone to sit beside them in the quiet evenings. More than once, Cliff found Kodiak lying beside a new arrival who had woken from a nightmare, the dog's steady warmth doing what no medication could. One autumn evening, nearly 3 years after that first night in the broken cabin, Cliff sat on the porch of his new home. The air had turned cold. The first frost had silvered the grass in the clearing. Smoke rose from the cabins along the tree line where the veterans lived. Laughter drifted faintly through the trees. Kodiak lay beside him. The dog was slower now. His muzzle had gone almost entirely gray. The scar on his shoulder from Afghanistan had stiffened with age, and he favored his right front leg on cold mornings. But his eyes were the same. Dark, steady, loyal beyond anything Cliff had ever known in a human being. Cliff rested his hand on the dog's back. "You remember that first night?" he said softly. "The fire barely stayed lit. The bear came through. You barked once and the whole mountain listened." Kodiak's tail tapped the porch boards. Cliff looked out across the clearing. The old shack stood quietly in the fading light, its gray boards silver with frost. Beyond it, the ridge rose dark against the evening sky. Somewhere beneath that rock, gold still waited. But Cliff had stopped thinking about the gold a long time ago. "Diane thought she was leaving me with nothing," he said. "The wind moved through the spruce trees. But you were there, and you found everything." Kodiak lifted his head and looked at Cliff, not asking for anything, not expecting anything. Just present, the way he had always been. Cliff scratched behind the dog's ears one last time as the sun dropped behind the blue ridge and the valley filled with the deep blue stillness of a mountain evening. Sometimes, the most valuable thing hidden in a forgotten place isn't gold or silver buried beneath the rock. Sometimes it's the chance to start again. And sometimes the one who finds it for you has 4 legs, a scarred shoulder, and a heart that never once considered giving up on you. Cliff thought his life was over the day he walked out of that courtroom. But Kodiak stayed, and that single act of loyalty rewrote the ending of his story. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe a loyal dog can truly change a person's life, type 1 in the comments. If you believe every veteran deserves a second chance, type 2. And tell us where you're watching from today. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because here at Hero Service Dogs, we share real stories about the bond between veterans and the dogs who never leave their side. And trust me, the next one might just surprise you even more.